It's now my pleasure to introduce Kathleen Johnnie. Kathleen is a First Nations consultant, member of the Penelakut tribe immediately north of Salt Spring. She has 19 years of experience in Crown consultation, working for many of the First Nations on southern Vancouver Island. Kathleen has worked with local governments, including municipalities, the Islands Trust, and regional districts. And we're wondering, Kathleen, if you could address the question, can you give us your thoughts on how Salt Spring becoming a municipality might impact the consultation process that currently exists with local First Nations?
Well, there is a significant difference between consultation with First Nations when it comes to local governments, between municipalities, the Islands Trust, and regional districts. There has been a court case that a First Nation brought forward against a municipality, and the First Nation lost. They based their premise for consultation requirement on the municipality on the fact that municipalities have their own charter, which was provided by the province of BC some time back. That the courts found that the only crowns in Canada were the province of BC and the government of Canada, and that despite the fact that the charter was drawn up by the province of BC, that municipalities do not have the same burden of consultation that the Crown does. They informed the province that they had to still consult with First Nations on matters that municipalities might cause infringements against First Nations title and rights and other interests. So that's a big court case. However, there is another court case that the province of BC can delegate procedural matters of consultation. That doesn't mean that they are divesting them the Crown of consultation responsibility. It just means they can delegate procedural matters of consultation to third parties. And they did that with the Islands Trust, and they did that with the regional district, and they laid out with the Islands Trust and the regional districts what they expected of them when it came to consultation with First Nations. And Linda very kindly reminded everyone last night that there are a couple of municipalities that are required to consult with First Nations, but they are resort municipalities. That's Whistler and, is it Sun Peaks? Sun Peaks. But they have a special incorporation. They weren't really incorporated based on there being the type of city that you would normally see. They were based on the fact that they were a resort community and that there were times of the year where there was a huge influx of people to those areas and they needed to be incorporated to manage their affairs, or so they believe. But for the most part, First Nations are not consulted by municipalities in the same way that the Islands Trust and the regional districts are required to consult with First Nations by the province of BC. And that causes some concern. It means that First Nations who are affected by municipal affairs have to work very hard to get their issues in front of a municipality. And I didn't share this example last night, but there was a development that the township of Duncan was going to have to make. It was called Paldi, and it was on Highway 18. And there was a huge concern by Cowichan tribes and a number of other nations, and I'm not speaking for Cowichan tribes, but at the time, at the time of a municipal hearing that was going on for that project, Cowichan tribes happened to be on a political retreat, and they couldn't attend the hearing, and they weren't aware of the hearing before they went on this political retreat, so they hadn't given their staff clear direction. And I was working for the Hulk Communum Treaty Group, which Cowichan Tribes was a member of, and so Cowichan Tribes staff asked me to attend the hearing and make some presentation to that municipality. Despite that, and despite the concerns raised by Cowichan Tribes otherwise to the Paldi development, the municipality decided that the development was more important, and they went ahead with that development. Despite the wildlife concerns, despite the environmental concerns that Cowichan Tribes raised, the municipality felt that the tax base and the other opportunities that that kind of development would create would be more important to the township of Duncan. So those are the kinds of things that become a problem for First Nations, that we take the time and the effort to lay out what our concerns are, and we're not heard in a meaningful and respectful way. We have to work harder with municipalities we have to work hard regardless of what kind of or level of government that we are working with, but with municipalities, because they have this little card that says we get out of jail free, we don't have to really consult with you, that has been a problem. Now, we understand that the framework agreement just came out yesterday, and there are certain requirements in the framework agreement that speak to First Nations, like potentially a First Nations advisory committee, and there are approximately 14 First Nations that Salt Spring Island Municipality would have to create a relationship with. And there are, there's another component of the framework agreement for incorporation where there could be protocol agreements. I haven't seen anything yet that would suggest to me that the lack of incorporation could not achieve those things. I know there have been protocol agreements with First Nations, with the Islands Trust. I know that we could create committees that work with the Islands Trust and the local trust committees. It's a matter of willingness on the local trusts, and it's a matter of willingness on the Islands Trust to say, we really have to create these relationships. And where that starts to come in from is from the community. Is it important to you? Because sincerely, I can affect what you are doing on your land. And you want to have a relationship with First Nations so that you understand why your land is important to us and why certain kinds of development on your land is not appropriate for what we think should be happening in that area. I went to one local trust, sorry, I know I'm supposed to close, but I'm going to be like Gary. I went to one local trust meeting and they said fences were appropriate right down to the foreshore for certain properties, and I said, well, I have an issue with that because right along the foreshore there are a lot of species at risk, species that are blue listed or red listed provincially, and species that are important to First Nations. And I don't want you digging into the ground in these areas because also along the foreshore there are a lot of our archaeological sites. So I don't want you digging in to put a post down. So if you're going to say fences are good, then use switchback fences and authorize only switchback fences. And they had a lot of concerns about that. They said, well, you know, what about privacy? And I went, you're on the foreshore. What privacy do you have? Because the foreshore is open to the public. So, you know, there are ways of making privacy without it being invasive to or effective to the ecosystem that is very dear to the foreshore, and it needs to be protected. And that, to me, is part of what the Islands Trust is here to do, is to preserve and protect. And it's a big part of what the Islands Trust is here to do. So when they're making decisions about things as simple as fences, they should be considering what is important to First Nations as well. And the way of doing that is starting to align what our principles are around preserving and protecting and what should be preserved and protected. So that's my big spiel about consultation and First Nations and the differences between municipalities and First Nations. It can be difficult, it's a hard road, and quite often it comes at the expense of expensive court actions with municipalities. And I don't want to see that. It's not my role to be threatening people. It's more, how do we achieve and create a relationship without us having to go there? And we try to provide some of the suggestions, and we hope that you can come back with some suggestions and work with us on how we can work together to preserve and protect these really important and sacred spaces. Thank you.